So I want to welcome you back to what will be the final session for today's portion of our conference. And that, of course, is the panel entitled Multilateralism at the Crossroads, the United Nations and Informal Intergovernmental Organizations. Now, there's no question that many recent developments have drawn attention to the role of the United Nations, as well as the challenges it faces to engage a number of unfolding realities. The increasing prominence of informal intergovernmental organizations is one such development, and our final panel of today will speak to this theme. To this end, we are very pleased to introduce you to our final panel's featured speakers. Our first speaker is Ian Hurd of Northwestern University, who joins us today from Evanston. He will be followed by Catriona Standfield of the University of Massachusetts, who joins us from Boston. And we will complete our panel by a contribution from Emel Parlar Dal of Marmara University, who joins us today from Istanbul. For a detailed biography of each of our speakers, please see the link to our panelists' bios, which was emailed to everybody who RSVP'd for our conference. And of course, after our panel's presenters share their initial remarks, we will have a question and answer portion to allow you, the audience, to submit written questions via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. And I will direct your questions to the individual speakers or to all the panelists as you wish. So let's now turn to our panelists. And to that end, I would like to now give the floor to Ian.
Thank you, David. I'm really happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this, look forward to the conversation. So I teach international law and politics here at Northwestern University. And like everybody that I know around my department, we're all trying to understand kind of what's going on in the world today with the UN and with global governance. And everyone seems to be coming up with a story to explain or to understand what's been lost, where things are going, and that adds up to an explanation of what's going on. I'm interested in the kind of emerging basic narrative, as I see it, a kind of common sense, commonplace that says that the UN, at least, has sort of collapsed in a formal sense, stopped being relevant in the way that it used to. And this is because, it is said, the strongest states just don't want to play along anymore with the rules and the institution. And I could say this narrative appears not just around the UN, but many other international institutions and sets of rules. So I see this as kind of a common sense, like an emerging, taken for granted explanation of where we are in the world. And I want to end up today by saying that this is kind of overstated, but perhaps not for the reasons that many people think. So let me start off by just with the basic reminder, the framework of the UN as an intergovernmental organization. So members are governments, and it answers to them, and it answers to their interests. A formal intergovernmental organization, of course, comes into action when the members want it to. Now that, in the case of the UN, entails some interesting math, because the multiplicity of governments means that it comes into action when enough of the right sorts of governments have overlapping interests that causes them to want the UN to do something. And that's a tricky thing to work out and gives lots of fodder for thinking about informal politics and diplomacy as well as the formal. But because the basic model is intergovernmental, the UN has always been a product of the interests of these governments. And maybe you could say that it acts when their interests align, and it does nothing when their interests don't. That's probably itself somewhat overstated. But at the core of it, it means that the governments are making the choices of when to use the institution and how, which also means then that they're making the choice about when the institution is not going to do anything because it doesn't serve what they see to be their interests. So this then helps us to look at moments where the organization looks sort of inactive as moments that reflect disagreement among the relevant powers. The Security Council today, for one, looks pretty inactive, despite the fact that there are many grand military conflicts for which one might think from reading the charter, the Security Council is the appropriate institution. Israel and Palestine and Russia and Ukraine look a lot like exactly the kind of interstate war that the Charter forbids and for which it was written as a kind of a remedy. But of course, the council is not able to do anything because the veto players in the council are kind of participants in those conflicts, more or less directly. Of course, this is the same as the Cold War. This pattern doesn't look new. It looks like pretty much what we got used to in the Cold War, in another period when the veto powers disagreed with each other and had many military adventures of their own for which the council had nothing to say. Right? We got used to thinking of the Cold War in this way, the Security Council and the Cold War in this way. Where this leads me is to think about the historical comparison that people are making as they understand the UN as in a point of crisis today, as they look back on previous times. I just said that the Security Council's circumstances don't look that different now than in the Cold War. But I think that there has been in the last 20 years an emerging narrative of liberal internationalism that imagines the second half of the 20th century as having been governed by rules and institutions rather than by power politics or by great power politics. And that narrative arises today to fuel this historical comparison where today looks different, more power politics-y, if you imagine that the second half of the 20th century was more rules and institutions-y. It's that historical comparison that concerns me, because it doesn't sound like a very good description of the second half of the 20th century. To say that in those times the UN was working well and its rules and institutions were governing is to miss all of the evidence of the times that it was also not doing those things, that this Security Council was blocked, there were informal innovations in other parts to accommodate what governments wanted to do through new channels as they tried to figure out how to work through the work around the blockages. So to say that the second half of the 20th century was governed by rules and institutions is a bit like saying the hills are alive with the sound of music. So, I mean, for sure, there's music on some hills, but not all hills and not all the time. In the same way, the second half of the 20th century was somewhat governed by rules and institutions, but not all the time and not everywhere. And the key to understanding that historical period is that the rules and institutions were the instrument of governance when the governments wanted them to be, when they were choosing to use these institutions, the choice, just like the choice of having music on some hills and not others. So I come back to thinking about the choices that governments are making about whether to use these rules and institutions, which I guess comes back to thinking about whether they believe that it serves their interests. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. If we take that perspective on that earlier historical period, then it doesn't look that different than our understanding of today, where it seems quite clear that the Trump White House has decided that certain international rules and institutions are just not interesting. Either they're contrary to what they see as the American interest, or they're just irrelevant. And so they're opting out. That choice to opt in or opt out is not that different, I would suggest, than what's always been going on in the last 100 years or so. So where this leads me then is to think that what we're seeing is not a turn away from rules and institutions, nor a return of kind of self-interested great power politics. I think any sensible historian will look at the last 100 years and see that both of those are continuous threads through international politics. But what's different is the set of interests that the Americans have, the American leaders have, or that they see that they have. It's a domestic change. It's a change in the political values and goals that the American government is pursuing. that's a kind of substantive change, one that we should study in terms of the goals and the politics of the individual leaders, what they're trying to achieve for themselves. It's not really a change in the institutional framework. There's been no formal change in any of these charters, but it changes the way that the politics unfolds because it puts different content into the institutions. So what I'm arguing for here, I think, is a more realistic thinking about international history in the last 100 years so that our historical comparison between now and then is a little more balanced, but also a turn to noticing how much the substance of goals matters, the actual content that leaders are trying to pursue. And American political science is often discourages people from thinking about those substantive goals and would rather think in generic terms about actors and institutions and preferences and patterns. But I think here we see why we need to pay attention to what it is these leaders are actually trying to accomplish, because that's the key to understanding the different ways that they use international organizations. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. I think you've really laid the groundwork for a wonderful conversation by pointing out, among other things, that there are historical patterns involved that offer us the opportunity to consider what's happening right now, I think, in a bigger context. So thank you so very much. At this point, let's turn to Catriona Standfield. Catriona, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, David, Jeff, Mildred, everyone who's organized this, and Ian, you've teed us up really nicely. So given the panel's theme on complex and turbulent diplomacy, I thought what a better issue to discuss than the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is actually almost exactly 25 years old as of October 31st. And I wanted to focus on it in relation to the UN Security Council. And I'll explain a little bit about what WPS is for those who might not be familiar, but my basic argument is that it's become an important symbolic resource for different kinds of diplomatic actors in the Security Council. And they can use it to pursue their interests, right? But here sort of broadly understood as including showing that they're good at diplomacy, right? Seeking recognition from each other, getting to define, what the work of the Security Council should be. And these uses vary, right, in terms of how aligned they are with the feminist goals, right, of many of the WPS agenda's proponents. So this presents opportunities and risks for the sort of next years of women, peace and security at a time of also really intense backlash to gender equality, including in the United Nations. So as I'm talking about it here, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is a group of 10 resolutions that the Security Council has adopted over time, starting in 2000 up to 2019. And they deal broadly with four main things: the participation of women in peace and security decision-making, gender sensitivity and conflict prevention, protection from gender-based violence, and mainstreaming gender in relief and recovery. So it was quite a watershed moment for the Security Council to become actively seized of an issue like WPS all of those years ago. And there's been a lot of academic and policy interest in the agenda over the last quarter century. When talking to people in the Security Council, right, I've been talking to diplomats as part of my research, I hear two contradictory things. The first is that the WPS agenda lacks teeth, so it's not implemented, right? The other is that it's a really contentious file that really deepens divisions among members. And this makes the sheer volume of council activity on WPS, which is a lot, somewhat puzzling, because why put sort of resources and political will into a file that's either not going to do anything or is actually going to worsen the dynamics of the Security Council, which are already bad enough. And we can imagine in an alternate timeline, WPS, like other thematic agenda items, sort of withering on the vine. HIV/AIDS is an example of this. Instead, that hasn't happened. There's been sort of increasing activity over time with broad participation from not just members of the Security Council, but non-members, as well as civil society and the UN system. So I'm really interested in what has kept WPS alive in the Council for all of this time and what might keep it going in the future and in what form. So my question is really, for whom has WPS, Women, Peace and Security, been useful? So like I said, the thing that I've kind of come to think is that, it's a very useful agenda. Even the most sort of patriarchal regimes have something to say about protecting women. So women is a very sort of broad issue that pretty much every state can hook onto in some way. So its breadth is sort of what allows every actor really to have a piece of the pie. So in addition to becoming part of the national interest for member states in different ways, it's also been a vehicle for civil society, UN experts, and non-member states to actually get access to the Council, which a lot of actors want to do because it is still one of the preeminent spaces for global diplomacy. At the same time, permanent members of the Council have been relatively lacking in interest in WPS compared to other files. And so that's actually opened up opportunities for elected members who serve these 2-year terms and they rotate in and out to actually kind of claim WPS for themselves. And what they are able to do is leverage formal and semi-formal rules. They can build coalitions and socialize each other and do all kinds of kind of interesting discursive stuff using WPS to really show how effective and savvy they are, and also sort of define what the work of the Council should be. Meanwhile, other states, use WPS to counter, those moves and to say, no, these are the core issues of the Council. This is who should really get to speak at the table. So let me illustrate with a couple of examples of how this has played out over time. So the working methods of the Security Council are basically the rules of procedure, and they have been sort of concertinaed back and forth with respect to women, peace and security. And Rule 39 is one in particular. It's the rule that allows Council members to invite individuals who aren't representatives of states, but who are sort of competent to speak to the Council and brief on particular issues. And in 2015, as an elected member, Spain really took this on, and they said that we're going to sort of, they really pushed this idea of competence to include female civil society briefers, and they made it a big priority to invite more and more civil society briefers. And other elected members who championed WPS took this on over time, to the point where in 2024, female and male briefers were at parity, which was quite an increase. So working through Rule 39, not literally changing the rule, but sort of changing its interpretation in practice and broadening it, elected members were sort of able to show their procedural savvy. They were able to kind of show their effectiveness, and this made the Council more permeable, particularly to civil society. But Rule 39, by the same token, has been a tool that Russia in particular has used. It's been waging a big campaign against gender as a concept and women's rights in particular, and it's brought that into the Security Council. So it has pushed back on this idea of competence to narrow it down, and it's created a situation now where in the past, these were consensus decisions around inviting these civil society briefers. Now, because Russia is pushing back, they have become decisions that have to be put to a procedural vote. So they've kind of increased in difficulty. You have to whip the vote before you can be sure that you've got the female civil society briefer you want. And there's also a quid pro quo there. Another example of this, as I mentioned earlier, is coalition building and socialization. So an example of this is when elected members in 2021, Ireland, Kenya, and Mexico established a presidency trio for women, peace, and security, where they said, we're going to use our presidencies of the council, which rotate monthly, to really push women, peace, and security. And this grew into the Statement of Shared Commitments on WPS in the council. And that was really driven initially by elected members, and only later did permanent members join into this. And they've done kind of some interesting informal things, right? In addition to committing to trying to bring WPS into negotiations, they've done things like WPS press stakeouts, where they're not formal, council decisions or anything like that, but they are meeting with the media to talk about women, peace, and security. There's also now kind of a training and socialization function where the Shared Commitments Coordinator reaches out to incoming elected members. They all have women, peace, and security leads who are responsible for the file, and invites them to a training, which is quite new. And this is a way to, of course, like inculcate a very particular understanding of women, peace, and security, where the self-identified like-minded states, many of whom are Western states, really shape how elected members think and act around women, peace, and security. So where does this get us, right? The takeaway here is that, WPS, just because it's self-interested doesn't mean there isn't like a commitment behind it, right? There are individuals who are committed to the sort of feminist goals. Likewise, a lot of this illiberal anti-feminist contestation is very genuine. It's coming from a strong belief that patriarchy is the natural order, and that should not be deviated from. And so we have actors, in the council, somewhat unexpectedly spending quite a lot of political will and resources on an issue that, even like at the start of WPS, right, it wasn't certain that this was going to become a fixture of the council. So the point here is that women, peace, and security is worth contending over, and it's worth keeping on the agenda because it does a lot and can do a lot for all kinds of different diplomatic actors. So when we read the Council's diplomacy on WPS through this lens, it becomes easier to sort of figure out this tension between toothlessness and contentiousness that characterizes WPS. So as we recognize the 25th anniversary, I think it's very, very important to really think in careful ways about all the strategies, right, that different actors use to bolster or undermine WPS and what it does for them, right? Not just sort of the normative agenda and the feminist goals, and to think about the risks and opportunities this presents. Just to name one, the W in WPS, right? This is a boon to sort of anti-gender actors like Russia and the United States, because it gives, WPS can be used to actually strip gender out of things and say, no, there are just two genders, it's men and women, and to really promote this very fixed and essentialist idea of gender as sex, which actually really undermines a lot of the feminist work that WPS comes out of. So this complex and turbulent diplomacy that we've been talking about, right? I see WPS as and gender kind of in the UN system, right? Really as a crystallization. It's a really, if you want to look at power politics, if you want to look at, how different kinds of actors jockey for recognition, then these are issues that are really revealing. Paying attention to women, peace, and security allows us to see how different actors kind of get access to forums, how they seek recognition, how practices change over time, and the bottom line being, this changes who does and doesn't get a seat in these diplomatic discussions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catriona. And I really appreciate your observations about WPS. And I think it's quite clear that the aims of WPS are more important than ever. And I think call attention to a number of voids at the moment and a lot of discourse internationally. So thank you very much for that intervention. So let us now turn to our final panelist, Emel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Wiseman for inviting me as a speaker at the 6th Annual International Conference of the Graduate School of Applied Diplomacy. I would also like to extend my gratitude to all the faculty members, including David and administrative staff of the Graduate School who organized this event. Since the time is limited, I will start right away. My talk will focus on fragmented multilateralism and international institutions, which is also the title of the Third World Quarterly special issue that I guest edited together with Professor Cooper and Samira Tudipama from Thomas Sankara University. I think she's listening to us right now on the panel. Here, I will try to present a framework by integrating arguments from my other articles and my new research on IIGOs, informal intergovernmental organizations. So let's start. We are living through a period in which multilateralism is no longer defined by a single architecture, a single set of rules, or a single center of gravity. Instead, it has become increasingly fragmented, contested, and informal. Today, I want to discuss how this transformation has reshaped global governance, why informal intergovernmental organizations such as G7, G20, BRICS, and MICTA have become more prominent, and what this means for states, other formal intergovernmental organizations, including regional organizations like the EU, ASEAN, etc., in a shifting institutional ecosystem. Let me begin with the diagnosis. So the current global order does not suffer from a lack of institutions. So this is my view. In fact, as Professor Cooper and Samira and me argue in our recent introductory article for Third World Quarterly, it suffers from institutional congestion, overlap, and complexity. The proliferation of both formal and informal venues has created what we call a fragmented and multiplex institutional environment. The roots of this fragmentation lie in three dynamics. First, the polycrisis of the international system. Second, persistent gridlock in formal international organizations. And the third, intensified great power competition. The consequence is a system in which states increasingly turn to alternative and sometimes informal arenas to bypass stagnation and pursue flexible forms of cooperation. Within this environment, informal intergovernmental organizations, IIGOs, have become especially salient. In the absence of effective problem solving through formal treaty-based institutions, IIGOs offer speed, flexibility, and selective participation. As I and my research assistant Matsumoto highlighted in our 2025 International Affairs article on legitimacy of IIGOs, informal institutions reduce sovereignty cost and avoid the heavy procedural burdens of formal IOs, yet they also create serious legitimacy and accountability dilemma. They operate with fewer rules, less transparency, and weaker oversight. This means that informal organizations can deliver more agility, but often at the expense of input and throughput legitimacy. The fragmented multilateralism we observe today is therefore not institutional decline. It is institutional diversification. And this diversification has widened the space for IIGOs in global governance. Let me illustrate two of the most well-known cases. The G7, for example, functions as a Western strategic coordination club, shaping narratives and norms without legal obligations. It doesn't offer any legality. The G20, on the other hand, acts as a hybrid steering committee for the global economy, offering a platform where formal and informal elements merge. BRICS, on the other hand, represents a form of contested informalism, challenging Western-dominated governance by building parallel informal forums. Finally, MICTA illustrates how middle powers use informal platforms to increase visibility, status, and niche influence in areas where they cannot shape outcomes within more hierarchical institutions. From the perspectives of formal intergovernmental organizations, this shift has profound implications. In our Third World Quarterly article on an informal mode for multilateral cooperation, I and Matsumoto showed that the EU as a regional formal intergovernmental organization has a nuanced IIGO strategy. The EU is involved in approximately 1/3 of all IIGOs. However, it does not engage more than 30% of 92 IIGOs listed in Babulas and Snyder's 2.0 IIGO dataset. Here, what is illustrative is that the EU avoids participation in BRICS, MICTA, G77, NAM, Quad, and ASEAN Plus groupings, viewing them as either politically contentious, strategically misaligned, or dominated by other formal intergovernmental organizations like ASEAN or NATO. One of our findings in this article is that the EU employs a multi-layered and selective IIGOs engagement strategy. Its engagement with IIGOs reflects its philosophy of principled pragmatism, pursuing normative objectives while adapting flexibly to global realities. The EU prioritizes IIGOs that reinforce its governance model while avoiding those that challenge its institutional integrity or coherence. In short, IIGOs have become a central diplomatic instrument for the EU to enhance its actorness and resilience, and it uses them to disseminate its norms, manage crises, or build coalitions. As a forward-looking perspective, in the light of US transactionalism and the rise of illiberal multilateralism, regional organizations, as exemplified by the EU in our recent article, are likely to seek a more strategic role in informal governance in the coming years. This is because all states now operate within a fluid system of multiple alignments. Such a landscape may push regional integration organizations like the EU to become more active within IIGOs, where they can both participate directly in decision-making and shape the rules of the game, and using these platforms to extend their influence and disseminate their norms. To make my argument more concrete, after presenting the EU example, I will touch upon another important topic, which is very related to informal governance and IIGOs, before concluding my talk. One thing is clear: developments in governance, and informal governance most particularly, are not independent from politics. Fragmentation and informalism cannot be understood without acknowledging regime politics. As Stolberg and Wickberg suggested in their 2025 work, even in formal arenas and institutions, regime-type alignment still matters. This dynamic also reveals the flip side. The global rise of authoritarianism is reshaping multilateralism. Authoritarian states frequently see informal institutions as attractive precisely because they minimize transparency, limit scrutiny, and weaken normative constraints. As a result, the growing influence of authoritarian actors has begun to erode both the input legitimacy of formal organizations and the accountability expectations we associate with democratic multilateralism. So what about IIGOs? Do those with authoritarian leadership or a high number of authoritarian members within an IIGO pose a threat to multilateralism, especially at the normative level? In a recent research, I and my research assistants also examined how regime type and membership compositions shape the agency of informal intergovernmental organizations. Our findings can be summarized as follows. First, democratic IIGOs demonstrate broader issue engagement, stronger global presence, and more visible norm entrepreneurship, whilst authoritarian IIGOs focused on narrow agenda, remain regionally focused, and exhibit limited norm promotion. When it comes to hybrid IIGOs, which constitute the majority, tend to be pragmatically inclusive rather than ideologically aligned. These results demonstrate that IIGOs are not authoritarian clubs, but hybrid and functional arenas where regime-type preferences still shape behavior. However, as more authoritarian and illiberal actors gain influence both in formal and informal settings, we may witness the normalization of illiberal multilateralism. The risk is not institutional collapse, but a normative drift, a world in which sovereignty trumps accountability and institutions become transactional rather than principled. In other words, the future struggle is not only over which institutions survive, but also over which norms survive. Three core points emerge from my analysis. First, multilateralism is transforming into a hybrid network and competitive ecosystem, so it is not collapsing. Second, informal institutions will remain central to global governance, but their character will be increasingly shaped by regime-type dynamics. Third, if authoritarian influence continues to grow, the normalization of illiberal multilateralism becomes a real risk, making normative vigilance as important as institutional design. Last but not least, the future of multilateralism will not be uniform, linear, or centralized. It will be plural, competitive, and negotiated. The question is no longer how do we restore the old multilateralism, but rather how do we remain relevant and principled in the new hybrid and highly networked multilateral order. Thank you.
No, we can all agree that we are living within an environment of disagreement. I think we would all have to agree that this was a very important conversation, and I want to thank everybody for your rich and nuanced contributions to that. So Ian Hurd, Catriona Standfield, and Emel Parlar Dal, thank you so very much for what you brought to this conversation. And before we end for today, I just want to call attention to the fact that we will begin tomorrow morning at 9:25 a.m. And our first panel will be entitled Diplomatic Training, Histories, Geographies, and Politics. That will be followed by a keynote by Audie Klotz of Syracuse University, who is the president-elect of the International Studies Association. You don't want to miss that. And then finally, we're going to finish our time together tomorrow by our final panel entitled Diplomacy's Domestic Dimension, Global Affairs and Domestic Publics. So I want to thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. I want to thank our audience, and I want to thank everybody for their marvelous questions. So thank you on behalf of the Gray School, and we look forward to seeing you here tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening, or morning, as it were, depending on where you're coming from to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.